In the winter of 1847, something walked out of a storm and into Millbrook, Vermont, and the survivors would never escape it. They called him Samuel Hawthorne. But no record of that name exists before the night he appeared from a blizzard that had already claimed 17 lives in Windham County. He spoke of lands beyond the mountains, of suns that shone differently and seasons that followed older laws. He carried medical knowledge that saved dozens during a deadly outbreak of winter fever, and yet, what the townspeople would soon learn about him would shatter their faith in humanity and force them to face truths no civilized mind dares accept. For 170 years, the Millbrook Historical Society has kept certain documents under lock and key. Not just because they reveal who Samuel Hawthorne really was, but because they detail what he did to survive in those frozen peaks, and worse, what he continued to do long after his so-called rescue. This isn't just a story of survival twisted into horror. It's proof of how far a human being can fall when stripped of civilization, and how easily a monster can hide behind the mask of a savior, slowly converting an entire community to his philosophy of existence. Before we go deeper into the winter that changed Millbrook forever, subscribe and hit the bell, because this is only one piece of America's darkest historical secrets. And drop the state you're listening from in the comments, because you might be shocked to learn how many disappearances like this happened near you during the brutal winters of the 1840s. The pattern of vanishings that followed Samuel Hawthorne's path through New England would eventually claim over 60 lives. Families vanished across 4 states, and the authorities never connected the dots, not until it was far too late. The records I'm about to reveal have never been digitized, never been seen by the public, and there's a reason for that. They hold truths about human nature most people simply aren't ready to face. Millbrook, Vermont, in 1847 was the kind of place where everyone thought they knew everyone else's business. Nestled deep in a valley between the Green Mountains, 40 miles northeast of Bennington, it barely scraped together 300 souls. Mostly farmers, loggers, and families clawing a living out of unforgiving land. Founded in 1789 by Revolutionary War veterans chasing cheap land and a clean slate, by the 1840s Millbrook had become one of those forgotten settlements wedged between bigger towns, reachable only by dangerous mountain roads that winter turned into impassable death traps. And the winter of 1846-47 wasn't just brutal. It was historic. Temperatures plummeted so far that Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, Harvard-educated, Boston-born, and living in Millbrook since 1843 after losing his practice to gambling debts, wrote in his journal that whiskey froze solid overnight in the bottle. The Connecticut River itself locked up, frozen 4 feet deep by January, cutting the town off from its lifeline of fresh water and trade. Even the toughest locals, like Henrik Bergström, a Norwegian immigrant who had endured Arctic Circle winters, swore they'd never seen anything like it. Main Street was the heartbeat of Millbrook, a muddy stretch in summer, an icebound graveyard in winter. There stood Jeremiah Prescott's general store, the town's supply lifeline and rumor mill in one. Prescott, a cunning merchant from Connecticut who had moved here in '39, recorded everything. His ledgers, part business account, part gossip archive, would one day become evidence of just how far Samuel Hawthorne's shadow spread. At the eastern end of Main Street stood the Millbrook Inn, kept alive by widow Abigail Foresk, whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years earlier. It was a beacon for stranded travelers, and it would be the stage for one of the most chilling arrivals the town would ever see. The Millbrook Inn wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the pulse of the town. On freezing nights, farmers and loggers packed inside, huddled over corn whiskey and card games, swapping scraps of news from the outside world like it was treasure. In the town square, the modest white church stood tall but weary. Reverend Isaiah Greenfield, a Yale-educated Congregationalist, had come to Millbrook in 1844 dreaming of forging a strong Christian community in the wilderness. But by the winter of 1847, the pews were thinning. Faith was eroding faster than the firewood piles. The endless isolation and brutal cold were forcing people to question if divine providence had simply abandoned them. Most families scraped by in drafty wooden houses, relying on whatever firewood they'd managed to haul in before the snow choked the forests. The wealthier few, like Thomas and Grace Thornbury, owners of the largest farm in the valley, enjoyed 2-story homes with multiple fireplaces and cellars stacked with preserved food. Their 3 children were the pride of the town, Sarah, just 12 but already running household chores, Mary, 8, with a boundless curiosity, and William, 5, the little boy everyone seemed to love. But by February 1847, Millbrook's struggles had gone far beyond the usual winter hardships. 5 residents were already dead from cold and disease. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger who'd once survived Arctic winters, was found frozen stiff in his cabin after a January blizzard crushed his chimney. Children loved him for his wild stories of trolls and the northern lights, but now he was just another name carved into the snow. Margaret Fairchild's infant had died of pneumonia despite Dr. Putnam's desperate efforts, and her grief hollowed her into someone unrecognizable. Worse still, the town's supplies were vanishing. No fresh deliveries since November. No hope until spring thaw. Dr. Putnam was running out of everything, his last bottles of laudanum and quinine nearly gone, his surgical tools so worn they made him fear even the simplest procedure could kill a patient. And through the snow-packed streets, people whispered about a cursed winter, a shadow that had settled over Millbrook like it was waiting for something, or someone. By late winter, Millbrook felt less like a town and more like a burial shroud stretched over the valley. The snow never stopped. Food was running out. And in the candlelit corners of the inn, old voices whispered about doing the unthinkable, abandoning Millbrook the second the spring thaw came. Then, on the night of February 18, 1847, something happened that would be etched into every surviving family's memory. Not just in Dr. Putnam's medical journals, but in at least half a dozen private diaries that all told the same chilling story. It began with 14-year-old Timothy Prescott, son of the general store's owner. He was checking the rear windows for ice damage when he froze. Out in the blizzard, in a storm so violent it had dumped 3 feet of snow since dawn, a lone figure was moving down the mountain path. At first, Timothy thought his eyes were tricking him. The snow was blinding, the wind screaming, and the shape looked wrong. Like a corpse walking through the white void. But no, the figure sharpened with each step, becoming unmistakably human. Only, this man wasn't stumbling like a desperate traveler. He wasn't lost. He moved with confidence, as if he had memorized the mountain itself. Timothy yelled for his father. Within minutes, half the men in Millbrook were crowded at the store's front windows, staring in disbelief. The stranger walked upright against winds that were bending trees sideways. He didn't slow. He didn't stagger. He walked as if the storm was nothing more than a light spring rain. By the time he stepped into the lamplight, the town was convinced they were watching a man step straight out of death itself. His name was Samuel Hawthorne. And everything about him was wrong. His clothes were like nothing anyone had seen. A long cloak, animal hide-like, but the texture was too smooth, too strong, almost like armor. The snow didn't cling to it, it slid away like water off glass. Underneath, his layers shimmered faintly, woven from a fabric that caught the lamplight like metal thread. And in his pack was salvation. Or at least, that's what they thought. Up close, Samuel Hawthorne was even stranger. The first thing people noticed wasn't his height, though at well over 6 feet, he towered over most of the town, it was his boots. They bit into the snow in ways no ordinary boots ever could. The prints were deep, precise, and patterned with a bizarre arrangement of metal studs in perfect geometric shapes. Dr. Putnam would later sketch them in his journal, remarking they matched no New England design, no European pattern, nothing he'd ever seen in his life. Whoever built those boots had done so for one purpose, to conquer terrain that killed other men. But what truly unnerved Millbrook wasn't his gear. It was his condition. By his own account, Hawthorne had walked for days through the blizzard, days in what locals called the White Death. Yet, he had no frostbite. Not on his fingers. Not on his toes. His skin was flushed, alive, warm. His movements were fluid, confident, like a man stepping off a coach after a short trip, not one clawing his way through a storm that had buried the valley in 3 feet of snow. Dr. Putnam examined him thoroughly, making notes in cramped handwriting, no tissue damage. No signs of malnutrition. This man has had warmth, food, shelter, recently. Hawthorne himself was built like a man forged in hard labor, broad-shouldered, calloused hands, legs thick with the strength of someone who had walked more miles than he had stood still. His hair was dark, streaked prematurely white, though he could not have been more than 35. But it was his face people remembered. Sharp cheekbones, a long, predatory nose, skin weathered but unnervingly healthy, and those eyes. Pale blue. Almost colorless in certain light. Like staring into ice over deep water. When he looked at you, it felt like he was calculating something about you, weighing, measuring, deciding. Children stared at him the way they might stare at a wolf, with a mix of awe and fear. Adults simply kept their distance. People in Millbrook couldn't explain it, but they all felt the same thing around Samuel Hawthorne, the need to keep their distance. It wasn't just his stare, it was the way he seemed to be recording everything. He'd watch the way your hand lingered on a door latch, how your eyes shifted when someone else spoke. He memorized the layout of every home, the pecking order of every family, who deferred to who. When he spoke, his English was flawless, too flawless. The accent was like nothing anyone had heard before. Not British, though parts of it sounded like it wanted to be. Not German or Scandinavian, but it carried faint echoes of both. Dr. Putnam, who had travelled far before settling here, called it an accent made of many places, yet belonging to none. Hawthorne's words were exact, almost surgical in their precision. He spoke like a man with years of formal education, and yet, sometimes, he'd slip. A strange phrase. An archaic term that hadn't been in common use for centuries. And then came his story. He claimed to come from beyond the great peaks, from valleys where the sun shone differently, where the seasons obeyed older laws. He spoke of my people, and the homeland across the white fields, a place where the wise lived by the old ways, and where survival wasn't about fighting nature, but bending to its ancient rhythms and accepting its cruelties. Children were drawn to him instantly. They'd gather at his feet to hear about far-off lands and customs stranger than dreams. Adults were less enchanted. They couldn't pinpoint why, but the longer they were in his presence, the more some deep, primal instinct whispered, danger. And then there was the satchel. It never left his side. A heavy, weatherproof bag made of the same strange, snow-shedding material as his cloak. Inside, he said, were his medicines and tools of survival. Nobody knew then that the contents of that bag would ignite the greatest nightmare Millbrook had ever faced. That first night, though, all they saw was a man who'd braved the impossible to reach them. A man who might be their salvation. In the glow of the Millbrook Inn's fireplace, with a mug of Mrs. Forrest's strongest coffee steaming in his hands, Samuel Hawthorne began to speak. That night, Hawthorne stopped being just the stranger and became something else, something the town might not be able to live without. It started with Sarah Thornbury. She'd been coughing for days, hacking so hard her tiny frame shook with each breath. Dr. Putnam feared the worst, consumption, and in Millbrook, that was often a death sentence. Hawthorne crouched beside her, listening, his pale eyes locked on her face. He didn't ask many questions. Just listened to the cough. Then, almost casually, he said, "It's the smoke. Your chimney traps it. Her lungs are full of it." From his satchel, he drew a tiny glass vial. The liquid inside was dark as ink, smelling faintly of pine and something sweeter, stranger. Unplaceable. He gave her 3 drops in warm water and told her to sleep. Within an hour, the cough had quieted. By morning, Sarah's breathing was smooth and steady, for the first time in weeks. Word spread like fire on dry grass. By sundown, half the town was waiting at the inn's door, clutching aching joints, fevers, burns, and infections. Hawthorne didn't just treat them, he saw them. A glance at a man's posture, a touch of a child's wrist, and he'd name the illness, down to the exact cause. He knew where to find herbs buried beneath snowdrifts, how to brew teas that stopped pain cold. And everything he gave, worked. Even Dr. Putnam, proud and cautious, had to admit, this man was saving lives. When Sarah's cough returned days later, sharper and more dangerous, Hawthorne's treatment changed. He boiled roots with strips of some dried meat he claimed came from mountain game, meat preserved in the old ways of my people. The pot bubbled for hours, the scent seeping through the inn. Sweet, but heavy. comforting, yet wrong. Underneath it all was a smell no one could name, the kind that sits in your mind like a shadow you can't shake. It started with a smell no one in Millbrook could name. Not the sharp bite of pine. Not the rich fat of venison. Something older. Wilder. The kind of scent that makes you feel watched. Mrs. Foresque, the undisputed queen of preserves and pickling, leaned in, desperate to solve it. But even she had nothing. Hawthorne only smiled, his voice low and strange. My people have kept these secrets for generations. It's how we survive when the mountains try to kill us. Whatever it was, it worked. 3 days later, Sarah Thornbury wasn't just better, she was running, laughing, alive. But her eyes told a different story. She whispered about nightmares that wouldn't let her go, visions of endless white landscapes, of hungry shapes watching her from the dark, calling to her in languages that made her skin crawl. They promised warmth. Food. A sacred feast. Her mother, Grace, was so thankful she ignored her husband's unease and gave Hawthorne the room above their kitchen. But gratitude quickly curdled into something else. Grace began keeping letters to her sister, letters she'd never send, chronicling the stranger's habits. He slept no more than 2 hours at a time, waking as if some distant howl had reached his ears. Many nights, she'd wake to find him sitting in the dark, unmoving, staring out at the snow as if counting the shadows. And then came the storms. While even the hardiest hunters barricaded themselves indoors, Hawthorne would vanish into the white oak for hours. Winds howled like wolves, frost burned skin in minutes, yet he returned without a single frostbite blister. His strange leather boots were barely wet. And he always brought something back. Sometimes it was plants no one had ever seen in Vermont winters. Sometimes, fresh meat. Deer. Rabbit. Game that local hunters swore had disappeared weeks ago. But when Grace touched it, it was still warm. Hawthorne claimed his meat came from animals he'd hunted deep in the wilderness. It was always fresh, sliced into perfect, surgical portions, cut so precise they almost looked intentional. He said these were ancient methods passed down from his people. But the town's best hunters weren't convinced. The bone shapes were wrong. The fibers in the flesh felt different beneath their fingers. The color wasn't the red of deer or the pale of rabbit, it was something in between, something unsettling. Then Dr. Putnam, trained in anatomy, made a discovery that froze his blood. While inspecting meat Hawthorne mixed into his medicines, he spotted fibers, striations, and cuts he recognized instantly, human muscle. When he confronted Hawthorne, the stranger didn't deny it, he laughed. That smile. That voice. In the true wilderness, Doctor, squeamishness will kill you. All meat is the same, it feeds, it sustains. The only thing that matters is how it's prepared, and the spirit with which you consume it. Grace's unease turned into horror one winter morning. She found Hawthorne at the kitchen table, humming a melody like a funeral dirge, polishing a silver locket with almost reverent care. The pattern was intricate, flowers etched into the metal, and Grace's stomach dropped. She knew that locket. She'd admired it many times around the neck of Rebecca Henley, the merchant's wife who had vanished with her husband in the mountains the previous autumn. No bodies, no tracks. Just gone. The Henleys had been swallowed by an early storm. Search parties found nothing. But here was Hawthorne, holding Rebecca's locket, smiling. It belonged to a dear friend from home, he said softly, eyes glinting. She couldn't make the journey, but her spirit travels with me always. Grace could barely breathe. Because in that moment, she realized the truth, the storm hadn't claimed the Henleys. Something else had. And it was living under her roof. Grace had seen the Henleys in town before, smiling and lively, stocking up on supplies. Now their locket sat in Hawthorne's hand, and upstairs, his room became the heartbeat of the Thornbury family's fear. At night, strange sounds leaked through the walls, soft, deliberate scraping, like tools working on bone, sometimes broken by muffled crying. Too rhythmic to be the wind. Too human to be ignored. When Thomas finally confronted him, Hawthorne's answer was calm, almost amused. Maps to guide me home when spring comes. Journals, so your people are remembered. He unrolled treated animal hide covered in symbols no one recognized, looping runes, strange root-shaped markings. The maps were unsettlingly precise: mountain passes, hidden caves, storm shelters, every place a desperate traveler might cling to life. But there were more. Tally marks. Dozens. And certain spots circled in a way that felt less like landmarks, and more like hunting grounds. Dr. Putnam's curiosity curdled into suspicion. He began documenting everything: Hawthorne's habits, his remedies, the transformations in his patients. And what he found was chilling. The pattern was clear: Hawthorne's cures worked instantly, fevers broke, lungs cleared, energy surged. But within weeks, every patient developed the same eerie craving, an obsessive hunger for meat. And in a town where winter had stripped the forests bare, that craving would only have one place to turn: protein available during the harsh winter. They also developed an unusual craving for meat, gnawing at scraps with near-feral urgency. Their tempers shortened, their manners eroded, and they began guarding their food with a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. Stranger still were the dreams, identical, vivid dreams of wandering endless snowfields where shadowy figures offered them warmth and sustenance in exchange for joining an eternal feast. Putnam's unease deepened into grim determination. He decided to analyze one of Hawthorne's powders, antler and roots, the man claimed. Under his Boston-trained microscope, the truth surfaced: strands of unmistakably human hair and shards of splintered bone. When confronted, Hawthorne didn't deny it. He smiled. "Ah, doctor. I had hoped someone here would grasp the truth of my work." His pale eyes gleamed. "Yes. Human tissue. The body heals the body. Prepared according to the sacred traditions of my people, it becomes the most powerful medicine known. It forges a bond deeper than your Christian sacraments, a communion of flesh." The implication struck like a physical blow. Hawthorne wasn't merely treating Millbrook's sick, he was binding them together in something far darker, feeding them a cure that demanded pieces of the dead. Timothy's mittened hands brushed away the last clump of snow, and his breath caught. The hollow wasn't just some random pit in the earth. It was deliberate. Shored up with timbers. Smoothed in places where human hands had worked the soil. Inside, stacked in meticulous rows, were wooden crates. Not the kind for tools or supplies, but heavy, reinforced boxes, each marked with symbols Timothy didn't recognize, jagged runes burned into the planks, the wood still faintly scorched. The boy reached for the nearest lid. It was nailed shut, but not completely. A sharp tug, and the top came loose with a groan of old iron nails. The smell hit him first. Not the sour tang of rotting meat, this was worse. It was sweet, almost cloying, a scent that wrapped around his lungs and made him gag. Inside were cuts of meat. Perfectly butchered, wrapped in oilcloth and coated in some powdery substance. They were packed in sawdust, as if someone had gone to great lengths to preserve them without ice. Timothy stared at the pale, marbled flesh. Too large for any deer. Too human in its proportions. He stumbled back, but his boot caught on something jutting from the snow. A skull. Small. The size of a child's. The bone had been polished smooth, the top sliced clean, like a lid. The boy's hands shook as he backed away, his heart pounding so loud it drowned out the wind. He wanted to run. To scream. But then he saw the tracks. Fresh footprints. Leading from the cave. And they weren't his. It started with a hole in the earth, but this wasn't just some random animal den. Timothy had stumbled onto something that should never have seen the light of day, a hidden chamber carved into the hillside, reinforced like a bunker, sealed tight from the world. The walls weren't wood or stone. They were lined with hides so perfectly treated they almost gleamed. But the texture? Wrong. Alien. The kind of wrong that makes your stomach churn before your brain even knows why. Then came the bundles. Each one wrapped in the exact same strange leather as Dr. Hawthorne's coat. At first, Timothy thought it might be hunting gear. But when he peeled the layers away, the cold punched him in the chest, because these weren't supplies. They were remains of lives. Stacks of clothing, neatly folded like someone was cataloguing ghosts. Men's work shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, all preserved, all damaged. Ripped. Cut. Torn away from bodies, not closets. Some carried dark stains that had seeped so deep into the fabric that they looked almost burned into the threads. And no two outfits matched in era or place, they came from everywhere. From years apart. This wasn't one tragedy. This was a collection. And the deeper he dug, the worse it got. There were personal treasures, wedding rings that had once promised forever, pocket watches that had counted someone's last seconds, silver crosses, photographs still curled with the memory of smiling faces. Children's toys. Trinkets no one would willingly part with. Each one spotless. Preserved. Displayed like trophies. Then Timothy found the sketches. Protected from damp with oiled cloth, these weren't the drawings of an artist. They were manuals. Anatomical diagrams so detailed they felt surgical, except they weren't about saving lives. They were about harvesting them. Notations pointed to precise cutting lines for maximum yield. Instructions for preserving meat through the brutal cold of winter. Pages showing how to break down deer, elk, bear, and then, chillingly, human forms. Treated with the same matter-of-fact precision. It was all there. The knowledge. The planning. The experience. This wasn't theory, whoever made these had done it. Timothy's breath froze in his throat. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. And in that moment, he realized the truth that made his blood run to ice. This wasn't a graveyard. This was a pantry. And Dr. Hawthorne? He wasn't saving the town. He was feeding it. Timothy's father thought it was just the fever talking, a wild winter nightmare from too many ghost stories whispered by firelight. But Jeremiah Prescott wasn't the kind of man who ignored his gut. And when his son dragged him through the snow to that hidden cache, even his iron sense of reason cracked. They didn't just find proof. They found the truth. Tucked inside, under layers of strange hide and bundles of stolen lives, was a journal. Same neat, deliberate handwriting as Hawthorne's maps. The entries stretched back over 3 long, cold years. And as Jeremiah read, the words started to feel less like ink on paper and more like a knife sinking in. The author called them expeditions. Harmless sounding, until you realized they were hunting trips, for people. Each page documented encounters with travelers and isolated families, written with the cold detachment of a scientist dissecting an insect. The details were precise, almost surgical. And slowly, a pattern bled through. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. The writer described stalking small groups, especially families, weakened by the mountains. Offering help. Gaining trust. Leading them into safer routes that were actually dead ends. Remote pockets of wilderness where no screams could escape. There, in the suffocating quiet of snow and stone, the killing began. One entry, Jeremiah's hands shook as he read it, was dated 18 months before Hawthorne ever arrived in Millbrook. It told of a family of 5, heading to Albany for the father's new job at a mill. The author had smiled, offered to guide them through a hidden pass to save time. But when the storm hit, the truth came out. The journal described their deaths in the same tone a butcher might use to explain how to trim a cut of meat. How each body was processed. How every usable part was stored. And it wasn't for robbery. It wasn't even for revenge. It was resource management. The author praised human flesh as the most nutritionally complete protein known. They wrote about preservation techniques for short-term meals, and for deep winter reserves. But the most disturbing passages weren't about the killing. They were about what came after. The author studied the psychology of eating human flesh, the cravings, the mental shifts, the way others, slowly and unknowingly, could be drawn into the practice. They wrote about introducing it in small doses, disguised, until the taste became irresistible. And that's when Jeremiah realized. Millbrook hadn't just been fed by Hawthorne's medicine. It had been fed Hawthorne. Jeremiah's breath fogged in the icy air, But the cold wasn't what made his hands tremble, it was the final pages of the journal. This wasn't just about killing. This was about control. The author described, step by step, how to erase the human instinct to recoil from cannibalism. Start with small doses, hidden in soups, stews, and medicines. Increase it slowly, week by week, until the subject was eating pure human flesh, without ever realizing it. And once the taste was in them, something changed. Not just hunger, obedience. The journal claimed it rewired people's minds, making them more open to suggestion, more willing to cross moral lines they once thought unthinkable. It turned neighbors into accomplices. Ordinary towns into feeding grounds. And as Jeremiah reached the most recent entry, the blood in his veins turned to ice. Everything described was happening right now in Millbrook. Hawthorne wasn't just feeding the townsfolk human flesh. He was building a community of cannibals, loyal, conditioned, and ready to help him kill again. Jeremiah's stomach churned. The man the town called a savior, the miracle worker who had dragged Millbrook back from the edge of death during the worst winter in living memory, was a predator hiding in plain sight. And now, Jeremiah held the proof in his hands. But proof wasn't enough. How do you accuse the man who saved your children's lives of being a butcher of men? How do you convince people to turn on the one person they believe was sent by God to rescue them? The truth was a double-edged blade. If he told them outright, they might call him a liar, and if Hawthorne caught wind, he'd vanish before justice could touch him. Jeremiah's mind raced. The town still depended on Hawthorne's treatments. Many were still weak from illness. And if Hawthorne spun a clever story, they'd cling to him even tighter. There was only one man Jeremiah could trust, Dr. Putnam. A man of science. A man who might help him expose this horror without unleashing chaos too soon. Jeremiah closed the journal, the weight of it pressing on his chest like a stone. He turned to Putnam, ready to drop the truth on him like a hammer blow. Putnam's reaction was. The moment Dr. Putnam heard Prescott's discovery, it was like a gunshot in a silent room, instant, raw, and impossible to ignore. He'd been biting his tongue for weeks. Quietly wrestling with a suspicion that Hawthorne's so-called miracles weren't miracles at all, and now, the evidence was in his hands. From that second, they moved like men racing against a ticking bomb. Putnam went in first, poking, prodding, throwing Hawthorne carefully crafted questions that seemed harmless but were actually knives. Where had he trained? Who certified his methods? Which great medical minds vouched for his work? Every answer was smoke and mirrors. No universities. No credentials. Just whispers of master healers in distant lands, and ancient knowledge that outsiders could never understand without spiritual preparation. It was the language of a man building walls, not bridges. Then Putnam dropped the bait. They could publish Hawthorne's methods in medical journals, spreading his treatments across all New England. For a moment, Hawthorne's mask cracked. His body stiffened. His voice sharpened. He claimed his work couldn't be written down, that sharing it with the uninitiated would kill its power, and might even cause great harm. It was a warning, but also a confession. While Putnam kept Hawthorne busy, Prescott turned into a shadow. He scoured merchant ledgers, roadside whispers, and the memories of traders who had braved the mountain passes for years. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed, and the picture was terrifying. For winters. That was the cycle. Every year, when snow swallowed the mountains, people vanished. Entire families traveling through the passes simply ceased to exist. Hunting parties that should have returned in days never came back. Lone travelers disappeared, leaving behind only half-buried wagons or fires still smoldering in abandoned camps. The pattern was perfect, too perfect to be chance. But the deeper Prescott dug, the further back it went. Not 4 years. 7. 7 winters. 7 seasons of quiet slaughter. Always in remote places, always when the cold would hide the bodies until the world had moved on. And every single missing person lined up along the same invisible trail, a harvest route, that stopped dead the year Hawthorne appeared in Millbrook. The town's savior wasn't just a fraud. He was a predator who had been hunting for years, and now, Prescott and Putnam were in his sights. Prescott's trail wasn't random, it was a map of calculated hunts. The disappearances snaked across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts like a grim migration route. In each region, the pattern was flawless, 2 or 3 years of vanishings, then, as if on cue, a stranger would appear. Always in a crisis. Always with the right skills. Always too perfect to be coincidence. In Grafton, Vermont, winter of 1844, diphtheria was tearing the town apart. Out of nowhere came Samuel Hawthorne, a healer who saved dozens with uncanny precision. By spring, he was gone, along with several families who'd supposedly left for better opportunities. No one saw them again. North Conway, New Hampshire, winter of 1845, famine was closing in. A man calling himself Samuel Blackthorne arrived with food, remedies, and survival tactics that seemed almost supernatural. But when investigators began digging into his past, he vanished like smoke. The missing count rose. It was a perfect con. Arrive in a moment of desperation. Save lives. Earn blind trust. Slowly introduce strange medicines and rituals. Then, either convert the whole community to a dark philosophy, or wipe out the witnesses. And always, before suspicion became action, he'd move on to the next hunting ground. While Prescott traced the path, Dr. Putnam made his own nightmare discovery. Examining Hawthorne's preserved medicines under chemical tests from his training, he uncovered something so grotesque it twisted his stomach. These miracle cures weren't plant-based at all, they contained human tissue. Not from one person, but many, meaning Hawthorne had access to an industrial-scale supply of bodies. And then came the punch to the soul: the medicines were designed to enslave. Chemical compounds that rewired the brain, making patients crave more treatments while breaking down their ability to resist suggestion. With every dose, Hawthorne wasn't just healing, he was programming them. The recoveries weren't miracles. They were the opening moves in a campaign of total control. A system so perfect, so manipulative, that by the time his victims realized what was happening, their minds already belonged to him. When Putnam finally confronted Hawthorne, expecting outrage, denial, or at least a show of indignation, what he got instead froze him to the bone. Hawthorne didn't flinch. Didn't deny. In fact, he smiled. A slow, relieved smile, like a predator whose prey had finally recognized the trap. "You don't understand the necessities of true survival, Doctor," he said, his pale eyes sharpening to a predatory gleam that made the air between them feel colder. "In the places I've been, the situations I've faced, the boundaries between medicine and other necessities vanish. The human body provides what the human body needs, if one has the knowledge and the will." He spoke with the calm precision of a professor explaining a well-tested theory, stripping the horror from the words until it sounded logical. "Your civilized society," he continued, "is bound by artificial taboos. Luxuries of the weak. My people learned long ago, when winter comes, when food runs out, when death stalks every home, squeamishness is a death sentence." Putnam walked away from that conversation with the sick realization that Samuel Hawthorne wasn't just a killer. He was a refined predator. A cannibal who had spent years perfecting the conversion of entire communities into believers of his twisted gospel, dressed up in the language of healing. And then Millbrook began to change. The townspeople's cravings grew darker. The meat cravings became urgent, feral. Families whispered of waking in the dead of night to find a loved one crouched in the pantry, gnawing on raw flesh. Children played violent games that involved grotesquely accurate discussions of skinning and butchering. Adults began hoarding trinkets from the dead, claiming they kept the spirits close, but the way they clutched those possessions was predatory, not sentimental. And outsiders became prey. When a lost traveler staggered into Millbrook during a March snowstorm, shivering, desperate for help, several townsfolk didn't rush to offer shelter. They gathered around him, silent, eyes scanning him the way a butcher sizes up a cut of meat. Something in the air shifted. If Putnam and Prescott didn't act soon, Millbrook wouldn't just fall under Hawthorne's spell, it would become a feeding ground. The moment the traveler stumbled into Millbrook, half frozen and gasping for help, the townsfolk didn't rush to his aid. They circled him. Silent. Watching. Dr. Putnam would later write in his journal that their faces carried the look of hungry wolves evaluating potential prey. That was the first moment he understood the town wasn't merely influenced anymore. It was hunting. The breaking point came just days later. Grace Thornbury's youngest daughter, Mary, 8 years old, began showing symptoms that made it terrifyingly clear how deep Hawthorne's infection of the mind had spread. It started with hunger. Not just for food, for meat. And not just meat, raw meat. Then came the dreams. Mary would wake in a cold sweat, whispering about the hungry people in the snow who wanted to share their feast with her, teach her the old ways of eating. One night, Grace went down to the cellar after hearing faint noises. What she found almost made her scream. Mary was crouched in the corner, gnawing on a raw hunk of salted pork. Her little hands and face were smeared with blood and grease, her mouth working with an almost mechanical determination. When Grace tried to take it away, her daughter growled. A low, animal sound, deep in her throat. Then Mary bared her teeth. Her eyes, God, her eyes, had the same pale, predatory gleam they'd all seen in Samuel Hawthorne. And when she spoke, the words were like hearing Hawthorne himself, his rhythms, his teachings. The teacher says we must eat what the mountain provides, Mary said, licking her bloody fingers. He says the old people were wrong to waste good food just because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. He says when we learn the right way to eat, we'll never be hungry again. Never fear the winter. Grace's stomach turned to ice. Hawthorne wasn't just feeding the town, he was reprogramming it. That same night, Thomas Thornbury discovered Hawthorne in their barn, a single candle casting long shadows over his workbench. At first, Thomas thought the meat laid out before him came from one of their animals. But as he stepped closer, he knew. The pale flesh. The fine, unmistakable texture. The structure of the bones. It wasn't livestock. It was human. Hawthorne moved with quiet efficiency, his strange surgical tools catching the candlelight as he cut, separated, and wrapped each section in treated cloth. Around him sat neatly arranged containers, some holding organs, others filled with parts Thomas couldn't even bring himself to name. This wasn't slaughter. It was craftsmanship. And Thomas understood, in a cold rush, that Millbrook had passed the point of saving. By taking what they need, no matter the source, Hawthorne finished, his voice almost reverent. Thomas's stomach churned, bile burning the back of his throat. The warm, coppery smell in the barn seemed to wrap around him, pressing against his ribs until his pulse roared in his ears. Hawthorne's pale fingers rested on the slab of human flesh as though it were some holy relic, his shadow stretching across the walls like something monstrous. "You're insane," Thomas breathed, but Hawthorne only chuckled, low and cold. "Insane?" He stepped forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate slowness, each bootful muffled by the straw. "No, Thomas. I'm free. Free of the illusions that chain men to weakness and death. I've given your daughter that same freedom." The words made Thomas's vision blur with rage. He wanted to lunge forward, to rip the knife from Hawthorne's hand and bury it in his chest. But behind that urge was the image of Mary, pale-eyed now, chewing raw pork in the cellar, speaking in that eerie, borrowed cadence. Hawthorne's voice. Hawthorne's ideas. "You think I won't stop you?" Thomas said, louder this time, his voice cracking under the strain. Hawthorne tilted his head, the flicker of the candle catching in his eyes like ice under moonlight. "I think you already know it's too late to stop me," he said softly. "The feast has already begun." And in that moment, Thomas realized something far worse than the truth of the meat on the table. It wasn't just Mary who had been fed. It was the whole town. "Do you want me to keep pushing forward into the explosive break where Thomas finally makes his move, or let this dread sit a moment longer before we snap the tension?" Opened it was not the same Thomas they had known. His skin looked ashen in the candlelight, lips cracked, eyes pale and glistening like a predator's in the dark. His clothes hung loosely on him, as though he'd shed weight in a matter of days. yet there was a taut energy in the way he stood, like a wolf poised to spring. "Brothers," he said softly, his voice carrying an odd, ritualistic lilt that made Prescott's stomach knot. "You came just in time. The feast is about to begin." The men exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Dr. Putnam stepped forward, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Thomas, where is Hawthorne? We need to speak to him, now." Thomas's mouth curled into a strange smile, one that held both welcome and warning. "He's waiting in the dining room. But you should understand, once you cross that threshold, you can't go back." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, rich, heavy, and somehow wrong. The chanting grew louder as they approached the dining room, the words in no language they recognized, yet every syllable seemed to scrape at something primal in their bones. And then they saw it. The table was set for 12, each place adorned with fine china and silverware polished to a mirror sheen. Candles burned low, their wax pooling onto the wood like pale, melted flesh. At the head of the table sat Samuel Hawthorne, immaculate as ever, his white hair catching the light like frost. Before him lay the centerpiece, a great platter upon which rested what could only be described as a butchered human torso, the skin peeled back to reveal gleaming muscle and bone. Around the table, several townsfolk they recognized, including children, sat motionless, their eyes glassy, their hands resting on the table as though awaiting a command. Hawthorne rose slowly, spreading his arms in welcome. "Ah, my friends," he said, his voice both warm and cold in the same breath. "I was hoping you'd join us for the last supper Millbrook will ever need. I can take this moment straight into the eruption of violence and chaos if you want it to hit full, cinematic intensity next. First mistook for a butchered animal, until the candlelight shifted, and the truth revealed itself. It was human. A torso, stripped of skin in places, the muscle glistening wetly, the ribs splayed open like a grotesque book. The head was gone, but one limp arm still hung off the edge of the table, the fingers curling as though in a final grasp for life. Hawthorne's hands were red to the wrists, his pale face radiant in a way that was almost holy, as if he were a priest standing before his god. He looked up at them slowly, his eyes bright and fevered. "Brothers," he said, voice rich with the gravity of a sermon. "You've arrived at the moment of truth." The chanting that had seemed faint outside now swelled to fill every corner of the room, a low, pulsing rhythm in that strange, unearthly tongue. The Thornbury children's lips moved in perfect sync with Hawthorne's followers, their small voices weaving seamlessly into the sound, each word vibrating with a dreadful energy. Dr. Putnam's breath hitched as he realized something even worse. The chant wasn't just sound. It was timed to the beating of a heart. A real heart. On the altar, beside the torso, a human heart sat in a silver bowl, still twitching faintly as though refusing to admit death. Hawthorne rose with deliberate grace, holding up a long, curved knife that gleamed in the candlelight. "This is the meal that ends hunger," he intoned, "the feast that binds us beyond death itself. Those who partake tonight will never again fear winter, or famine, or the loneliness of dying in the dark." The circle's eyes turned toward the newcomers, and in that instant, Dr. Putnam understood. They weren't guests. They were the main course. If you want, I can take the next part straight into the blood-soaked eruption of the March 15th massacre with full, relentless intensity. Leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Putnam's with an intensity that felt almost physical, like the press of a hand against the doctor's chest. "You call it horror," Hawthorne continued, his voice low but thrumming with conviction. "I call it balance. Nature wastes nothing. The wolf does not apologize to the lamb. The soil asks no permission from the corpse." He stepped around the altar, moving closer to the group, the gleam of his blood-slicked tools catching the candlelight in sharp flashes. Behind him, young Mary sat at the table, her small hands resting on the white-stained cloth, her expression one of calm anticipation, as though she were waiting for a lesson to resume. Hawthorne's followers began to rise from their seats, slow and deliberate, their faces eerily devoid of emotion yet radiating a single, unmistakable intent. Every shuffle of feet, every creak of floorboard seemed to pull the room tighter around Putnam and the others. Jeremiah Prescott's hand twitched toward the hunting knife at his belt, but Hawthorne noticed. "I wouldn't," he said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "You'll spill blood before it's time, and that is the one thing I do not allow." Reverend Greenfield's voice shook as he stepped forward. "This is not survival, sir, it's abomination." Hawthorne smiled faintly, as though humoring a child's misunderstanding. "Abomination? Reverend, what do you think your communion truly is?" The low chanting began again, not loud, but close, so close it seemed to seep from the very walls. It was impossible to tell which of the followers had started it. The rhythm was slower now, heavier, each syllable deliberate, pulling the air into something dense and suffocating. And then Hawthorne extended his hand toward the altar. "Join us, Doctor. Reverend. It's time you learned what it truly means to be spared from winter." At that moment, Putnam realized they weren't going to arrest Hawthorne. They were going to have to fight their way out, or be fed to the feast. I can now take this directly into the March 15th massacre sequence with an explosive, Mr. Beast-style escalation that makes the reader feel trapped in that candlelit room with them. More dangerous than their frail frames suggested. Sarah went for the knees, Mary for the hands, William for the throat, each strike aimed to cripple, disable, and open the way for the adults to finish the job. The room erupted into chaos. Candlelight flared wildly as bodies slammed into furniture, toppling the makeshift altar and sending containers of human remains spilling across the floor. The coppery stench of blood mingled with the smoke of overturned candles, turning the air into something thick and choking. Dr. Putnam swung his medical bag like a club, striking one of the neighbors squarely in the jaw, but the man barely staggered before lunging again, teeth bared. Jeremiah Prescott's knife finally came free, flashing once in the dim light before sinking into a shoulder, yet the wounded follower only snarled and pressed forward, as though pain had been trained out of them entirely. Hawthorne stood in the center of it all, untouched, his calm expression never wavering. He simply watched, the faintest smile on his lips, as if the violence unfolding was a perfectly rehearsed demonstration. "Do you see?" he called over the roar of struggle. "They fight without fear, without hesitation. This is what survival looks like." Constable Hartwell, blood pouring from the rakes across his face, tried to level his pistol, but Thomas Thornbury was on him again, forcing the barrel toward the ceiling before the shot could fire. The crack of the gun echoed like thunder in the small room, showering everyone with plaster dust from the rafters. Somewhere behind the chaos, young Mary had her teeth buried in Reverend Greenfield's forearm, her eyes burning with a feral light that made the Reverend's knees buckle. Grace was already moving in to finish him with the butcher's knife. Putnam knew then, this was not a fight they could win by overpowering their attackers. If they stayed in this room one moment longer, they would be torn apart and fed to the same altar they had just seen. This moment is the perfect point to launch into the full-blown March 15th massacre scene, where the battle turns into an all-out, no-holds-barred escape attempt through the heart of Hawthorne's compound. Since childhood, men and women whose weddings they had attended, whose harvests they had celebrated, whose laughter had once filled the town square. Now, those same faces were masks of cold hunger and unwavering devotion, eyes lit with the same unnatural fire that burned in Hawthorne's own. The Thornbury house had been fortified in ways no ordinary farmhouse ever should be. Windows were barricaded with heavy timber. Doors had been reinforced from within. Every approach was covered by murder holes and firing positions. Even the barn had been turned into a killing ground, its loft stacked with hay bales for snipers, its floor sown with sharpened stakes hidden beneath straw. On the first night, the townspeople tried a direct assault. They came with axes, shotguns, and torches, driven forward by the righteous fury of those who believed their neighbors' souls might still be saved. But as they broke across the open ground, the converts poured from the shadows like wolves bursting from a den, silent at first, then screaming with a pitch that made the blood run cold. Farming scythes hooked ankles, dragging men down into the mud. Children darted in and out between the attackers' legs, slashing tendons with paring knives and retreating before a counterblow could land. Women, faces blank but eyes burning, hurled boiling water from upper windows, the steam rising like ghosts in the moonlight. By the second night, the attackers understood they were not facing mere victims under a madman's sway. They were battling a militia, one forged in secrecy, hardened by hunger, and drilled in the art of killing by a man who saw himself as both surgeon and prophet. Hawthorne appeared on the balcony that night, his white surgeon's coat flapping in the cold wind, illuminated by the flicker of burning torches. He called out across the killing field, his voice carrying in the stillness between gunshots. You starve while we feast. You freeze while we thrive. You cling to rules written by dead men, while we write new laws in blood. Which of us is truly civilized? By dawn of the third day, Millbrook was a town divided, one side fighting for the last shreds of the world they knew, the other defending the new order Hawthorne had built. The final push toward the Thornbury house was not about rescue anymore. It was about eradication. This is the exact point where the Mr. Beast-style narrative explosion would hit, the siege breaking into its final, unstoppable crescendo, and the real massacre beginning. Ever returned, and none of them came back whole. Those 12 were walking specters, their bodies gaunt but eyes still flickering with some remnant of Hawthorne's creed. They spoke little of what had happened in the mountains, and when they did, it was in half-mad fragments, whispers of the cold that burns, of the great feast, of the trials that made us worthy. Children refused to sleep alone. Grown men startled at the sound of footsteps behind them. Dr. Putnam's journals record a town haunted not just by the loss of its people, but by the corrosive suspicion that spread like rot through every surviving household. If Hawthorne's converts could pass unnoticed for months, who was to say some of them hadn't chosen to stay behind? Neighbors eyed each other across the church pews. The clink of a carving knife at supper could silence an entire table. Winter claimed more lives that year than any in living memory, but the deaths from hunger and cold were almost merciful compared to the ones that followed. Violence flared in fits, an argument over a missing lamb ending in a blooded corpse, a family locked inside their own home and left to freeze. Some whispered that Hawthorne had left behind seeds of his doctrine, planted in the minds of those most desperate, waiting for the next true scarcity to make them bloom. And in the years that followed, travelers spoke of a ragged band seen at the edges of the White Mountains, men, women, and children moving in silence, faces hidden beneath frostbitten scarves. They carried no lanterns. They built no fires. But sometimes, on the stillest nights, the wind would carry the sound of their laughter, cold, amused, and utterly inhuman. That's where the scene closes, but we could push this further into a final, pulse-pounding Mr. Beast-style narrative payoff by showing the first modern-day rediscovery of Hawthorne's sect, tying the old horror to a fresh, shocking reveal. That would let the story slam shut with a present-day gut punch. Multiple crude cabins built from hand-hewn logs, arranged in a rough semicircle around a central fire pit. Animal hides, and some that were unmistakably human, were stretched on drying racks. The fire pit was ringed with large stones, each one carved with strange, almost runic symbols that no local scholar could identify. Inside the cabins, investigators found signs of recent occupation, rough bedding of pine boughs, stacks of preserved meat, and jars of Hawthorne's distinctive medicinal concoctions. But there were no people. No tracks leading away. No signs of struggle. It was as if the entire population had risen one night and walked into the forest as a single, silent body. Dr. Putnam's final journal entries grew increasingly grim after this discovery. He noted that the settlement's location suggested it had been chosen for its isolation, yes, but also for its visibility of the surrounding valleys. From that vantage point, one could watch the movements of every traveler, every shipment, every vulnerable homestead for miles. The implication was chilling: Millbrook was never the endgame. It was a training ground. The very last page in his journal, dated only weeks before his death in 1879, contains just a single line written in a shaky, uncharacteristic hand. They are still watching. After that, the historical record goes silent. The Vermont Historical Society sealed Putnam's papers, the mountain settlement was left to rot, and Hawthorne's name faded from common memory, until the occasional hiker vanished, or a hunter returned to town pale and unwilling to speak of what they'd seen in the deep woods. If you want, I can now roll this directly into a modern-day discovery scene so the old horror bleeds into a present-tense, Mr. Beast-style climax where the legend suddenly becomes terrifyingly real. That would give the chapter an explosive ending rather than a slow fade into mystery. Private detectives hired by the families of his victims. It was as if he could read the searchers' movements before they made them, always staying one step ahead, always vanishing into the labyrinth of the mountains just before the noose tightened. In the years that followed, sightings of Hawthorne were reported in scattered communities from Maine to upstate New York, always during winters of famine, epidemics, or political unrest. Sometimes a respected local doctor or traveling preacher would arrive with uncanny knowledge of herbal medicine, able to heal the sick and win the loyalty of the desperate. Weeks or months later, the community would suffer a sudden rash of disappearances, unexplained deaths, or strange feasts whispered about behind closed doors. Authorities never proved these incidents were connected, but in Hawthorne's journals, Dr. Putnam found meticulous notations, coded references that matched the dates and locations of these events almost perfectly. Each entry ended with the same chilling symbol, a black triangle surrounded by 13 dots. Putnam noted in the margin that the same emblem had been carved into a stone inside the mountain settlement's largest cabin. The pattern suggested something terrifying. Hawthorne had not retired, not gone into hiding, but was actively seeding new communities, refining his methods, and feeding his data back to unseen directors who appeared to be orchestrating a project far bigger than Millbrook. By the time federal authorities declassified fragments of the investigation in the 1920s, more than 50 small towns across New England had simply ceased to exist during brutal winters. The official reports blamed influenza, blizzards, and economic collapse. But in Dr. Putnam's private notes, the ones never entered into public record, he wrote, "It is not the cold that kills them. It is the hunger. And someone has taught them how to feed it." That's where the paper trail ends. And yet, stories persist, hikers vanishing without a trace, hunters finding crude meat smoking racks deep in the backcountry, lone cabins with fires burning but no footprints in the snow. If you'd like, I can now flow this directly into a modern-day sequence where someone stumbles on Hawthorne's symbol again, and everything from this ancient history suddenly slams into the present. That would turn all this lore into a ticking time bomb. Reveal chilling details that had never been part of the official account. Among the belongings left behind by the missing miners were crude leather-bound journals, filled with strange dietary instructions, hand-drawn maps of the surrounding wilderness marked with unfamiliar symbols, and meticulous lists of names, not of the miners themselves, but of families in nearby towns. Several entries, written in a different, neater hand than the miners' usual scrawl, described training days, in which small groups were taken deep into the forest and taught hunting and preservation techniques that went far beyond mere survival. They were taught how to build smokehouses from green wood that left no scent detectable to scavengers, how to prepare meat so it could be stored underground for years without rotting, and, most disturbingly, how to process the human body in a way that was efficient, quick, and left no trace for search parties. One entry was dated March 12, 1859, just weeks before the disappearance. Those who have passed the trial no longer dream of home. They belong to the winter now. Soon, they will teach others. The handwriting matched perfectly with samples confirmed to be Samuel Hawthorne's. By the time these records surfaced in the early 20th century, the trail was cold. Hawthorne's name had become something between a ghost story and a professional embarrassment for law enforcement. But a small circle of federal archivists, intelligence officers, and academic researchers continued to quietly share sightings and patterns. The unsettling conclusion they reached was this: Hawthorne was not wandering aimlessly. He was moving with purpose, following a map known only to him and, if his journals were to be believed, to the mysterious council that had first sent him to Millbrook. Each appearance was not a random opportunity but a phase in a larger, generational plan. The Michigan incident, like Millbrook, was just one node in a network slowly expanding westward and northward. And while no living person could confirm it, some whispered that descendants of those taken in 1859 were still out there, in places where winter rules all, and the old ways never died. I can now push this into a final haunting bridge that will connect Hawthorne's 19th century trail straight into a modern-day investigation, so the past's horror collides head-on with the present. That way, the reader feels the trap snapping shut. By the time the supply wagons rattled into that frozen Michigan camp, the scene was worse than anyone dared imagine. The men who remained were not the same ones who had been left behind months earlier. Their eyes were hollow. They clutched at scraps of food like starving wolves. They preferred their meat raw. And the way they looked at outsiders, as if they were weighing them. The camp itself had changed too, crude symbols carved into the walls, storage pits dug deep into the permafrost, and a rigid social hierarchy that had nothing to do with mining and everything to do with obedience. The last man to study them, Dr. Putnam, would not survive the winter. But before pneumonia claimed him in 1863, he left behind a single, razor-edged warning, one that would haunt researchers for generations. The man we knew as Samuel Hawthorne understood something about human nature that civilized people prefer to ignore. With the right conditions, the proper techniques, and enough patience, anyone can be convinced that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary. He didn't create monsters. He gave them permission to emerge. History would prove him right. 14 years after Millbrook, the Civil War ripped across the country, and suddenly, atrocities that had once been unthinkable became daily survival. Disasters and panics in the decades that followed kept proving the same grim truth: it doesn't take much to push a community off the cliff. Modern psychology has caught up to what Hawthorne seemed to know instinctively, that if you break people down slowly, isolate them from other voices, and feed them a new truth one small bite at a time, they will swallow anything. Even each other. And here's the part no one likes to say out loud: we still don't know everything. We still don't know who Hawthorne really was. We still don't know the reach of the organization he served. What if his network never died? What if there are still places, out there in the cold, where survival has no morality? Because if Samuel Hawthorne was right, it wouldn't take a supernatural monster to destroy us. Just a man with pale eyes, a warm smile, and the right kind of winter.